Corbin Hale had never lost his composure. Not when he faced his enemies. Not when his underground empire was threatened. Not when the decisions he made could shift the balance of power across the entire northeastern United States. But that night, when he opened the security camera system inside his own mansion, something he had never once reviewed for footage from within the house, his hand froze over the rewind button. On the screen, in the marble kitchen he crossed every morning, a young woman was kneeling on the floor. Her bare hands were gathering shard after shard of broken glass. Blood seeped from the palm of her right hand, but she didn't stop, didn't flinch, didn't look up to ask for help, as though bleeding were simply a normal part of her work. 3 steps away from her, his fiancée stood leaning against the kitchen counter, her arms folded across her chest, her eyes lowered to the girl on the floor with a look of satisfaction she didn't even bother to hide. And in the corner of the kitchen, his butler stood motionless, a towel in his hand, the very towel he should have given the girl long ago, but he didn't. He only stood there, watching, as though this were an ordinary sight. But what made Corbin go still wasn't the blood, wasn't the glass, wasn't the cold smile on his fiancée's lips. It was the girl's eyes. For one brief moment, she looked up, not at anyone, only by reflex, when a sharper piece of glass cut deeper, and in those eyes there was no pain, no pleading, no anger, no anything at all. There was only emptiness, the emptiness of someone who had grown so used to being hurt that there was no reaction left to give. Corbin rewound the footage by 1 week, 2 weeks, 1 month, and then he understood. This wasn't an accident. It was a system that had swallowed 15 women in 3 years beneath his own roof, behind his back, without his ever knowing. Or more truthfully, he had chosen not to see, and everything began with a photograph sent at midnight, by the trembling hand of the only woman in that house who had finally dared to say, enough was enough. Press like if you believe every person deserves to be treated with dignity. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss stories powerful enough to change the way you see the world. Corbin shut off the screen in the security room and sat in the dark for nearly a full minute before opening his phone. The glow of the screen lit his face, throwing the tight line of his jaw into sharp relief. He pressed the number that had sent the photograph and called it back. The phone rang once. Only once. On the other end, there was the sound of a soft breath before an older woman's voice came through, rough but alert, the voice of someone who had been sitting beside the phone ever since pressing send. Mr. Hale. It wasn't a question. It was a confirmation. Corbin recognized that voice at once. Odette, the oldest housemaid in the mansion, the woman who had worked there since before Priscilla stepped into his life. She had always been there, always quiet, always finishing everything without needing to be told. Corbin had never given that silence much thought. Now he was beginning to understand how heavy it had been. You sent the photograph, he said, not asking. Odette was silent for 2 seconds. Yes. The hand in the photograph belongs to Brielle. Yes. How long has this been going on? That question had already been asked once before, but this time it carried a different weight. He wasn't asking about an incident. He was asking about a history. Odette drew in a slow breath. When she spoke, her voice didn't shake, but every word was measured, as though she had rehearsed this answer in her mind for many sleepless nights, since the first one. 3 words. And they opened a chasm Corbin had never seen the bottom of. He said nothing for several seconds. Then he asked the question he truly needed to understand. Why did you wait until now? Odette didn't answer right away. There was the faint creak of a chair on the other end, as though she were sitting down, or shifting her posture to brace herself for something heavier. Because I watched 13 women leave before Brielle, she said. 13 women. Some cried. Some didn't say a word. Some begged to stay and were sent away anyway. Some left in the middle of the night as though they were escaping, and I saw all of it. She paused. I didn't stay silent because I didn't want to speak. I stayed silent because I knew that if I did, I would be the 14th. And after me, there would have been no one left to stand on Brielle's side, even if only in silence. Corbin listened, and felt something tighten inside his chest. It wasn't anger. Not yet. It was something heavier than anger. The feeling of a man realizing that the protection he had believed he was providing to this house had never existed at all. Then why tonight? He asked. Because tonight I saw blood, Odette said, her voice dropping lower but not weaker. I had seen Brielle being scolded. I had seen her re-clean things that were already spotless. I had seen her lower her head when she had done nothing wrong. But tonight I stood in the hallway and watched her kneeling on the kitchen floor, picking up broken glass with her bare hands, blood running onto the tiles while she didn't stop, didn't cry out, didn't look up at anyone, as though she had forgotten that she had the right to say she was in pain. She stopped speaking. Corbin heard her swallow, and I understood that if I stayed silent for one more night, then my silence would no longer be self-protection. It would become complicity. The security room was dark and cold. Corbin sat in the only chair in the room, the phone pressed to his ear, his eyes fixed on the dead screen that still seemed to hold the image of Brielle kneeling on the kitchen floor as clearly as if it had never gone black. He wanted to say something, but no sentence was enough. In the end, he said only, "Thank you." Odette was quiet for a moment. Then she added, her voice gentler now, almost a whisper, "Don't thank me. Fix it." Then she hung up. Corbin remained there for a long while, the phone still against his ear even though the call had ended. In the darkness of the security room, he understood one thing more clearly than any financial report or territorial map he had ever read. The person who broke the system in that house wasn't him. It was a 60-year-old woman with trembling hands and a photograph sent at midnight. Corbin didn't sleep that night. After Odette hung up, he remained in the security room for nearly another hour, staring at the dark screen and listening to the silence of the house echo through the thick walls. When the first light of morning began to slip through the crack beneath the basement door, he rose, went upstairs to his study, opened his laptop, and sent a single email to his private accountant. The message was brief. Send the full household payroll records from the past 3 years, including start dates, end dates, and reasons for resignation if any notes were recorded. He hit send at 5:17 in the morning. The reply arrived before 6. The accountant attached a spreadsheet file. Corbin opened it, and 15 lines of names stood in order across the screen, like an indictment no one had written. Yet every number was evidence. 15 women, in 3 years. With the exception of those currently employed, not one of them had lasted longer than 3 months. The first line began 3 months after Priscilla moved into the mansion. That woman had lasted 26 days. The reason listed beside her name read, "Did not meet standards." The second line, 40 days. Inappropriate attitude. The third line, 3 weeks. Left without notice. Corbin read every line. Each name belonged to a flesh-and-blood woman who had entered this house expecting an ordinary job and had left carrying something heavier than unemployment. The reasons for leaving changed, but the language repeated itself with such frequency that Corbin understood they hadn't been written to explain. They had been written to close the file. Failed to meet expectations. Lacked initiative. Unsuitable for the environment. Every phrase was vague enough that no one could challenge it, and professional enough that no one would bother asking questions, including him. Especially him. Corbin stopped at the 9th line. Ruth Calloway. Length of employment, 43 days. Reason for leaving, not one of the familiar, polished phrases. This line carried a separate note, handwritten in Randall's script and scanned into the system. Cried when corrected. Not suitable. Corbin read that line twice. A woman had been treated badly enough to cry, and her tears hadn't been seen as a sign that something was wrong with the way she was being treated. They had been recorded as proof that she wasn't strong enough to stay. Her tears had become the reason she was dismissed. He leaned back into his chair and looked up at the ceiling of the study. In his mind, fragments of memory began to arrange themselves into a new order. He remembered the dinners when he had asked Priscilla about the household staff. How is the new maid doing? And Priscilla had never taken longer than a breath to answer. The previous one wasn't suitable. I've already found someone new. Or, this kind of work requires precision. Not everyone is a good fit. Or, don't worry about the house. I've got it handled. Every answer had been smooth. Every answer had sounded reasonable. Every answer had ended the conversation before it had the chance to begin. And Corbin remembered himself nodding each time. Nodding, then returning to work, returning to calls, returning to flights, returning to the world outside this house where he controlled everything through sharpness and detail. But inside his own home, he had accepted a one-line summary in place of the truth, not because he believed it, because believing was easier than asking, and asking would have meant looking at what he didn't want to see. Corbin scrolled down to the last 2 lines. The 14th line, Odette. Start date, before Priscilla entered the house. Still employed, no note of departure. The 15th line, Brielle Lawson. Started 11 months earlier. Still employed. No note of departure. The only two who remained. One because she had been there too long to be dismissed without drawing attention. One because she had learned how to endure better than the 12 women before her. Corbin closed the laptop. He didn't snap it shut. He lowered it slowly, as though the weight of what he had just read had settled into the hinges themselves. He sat motionless in the study, looking out the window where the pale morning light was pouring into the mansion, falling across gleaming hallways, perfect surfaces, flower vases placed with precision down to the last centimeter. And he understood, more clearly than ever before, that he hadn't been deceived. He had chosen not to see. Every time he nodded at one of Priscilla's answers that had come too smoothly, every time he turned away from a question left unasked, every time he walked down a polished hallway without asking who had knelt to make it look that way, he had been making a choice. And his absence from this house, the long absence that had stretched across the past 3 years, wasn't innocent. It was the condition that had made all of it possible. Corbin closed the laptop and rose from his desk. He didn't wait another minute. He walked through the main hallway, turned into the service corridor behind the kitchen, where he knew Brielle usually began her shift early. She was standing beside the shelf of cleaning supplies, her back to him, her hands arranging bottles of cleanser into neat rows. When she heard his footsteps, she turned, and her body reacted before her mind had time to process. Her shoulders lowered. Her eyes dropped to the floor. Her arms fell straight to her sides, her fingers drawing inward as though she were trying to take up as little space as possible. It was the posture of someone who had been trained to believe that any attention from a person in power was a warning of danger. "Brielle," Corbin said, keeping his voice low and even. "Come with me to the sitting room." She didn't ask why. No one in her position ever asked why. She only gave a small nod and followed him, always keeping exactly 3 steps behind, her canvas shoes making no sound on the wooden floor. The sitting room in the early morning was filled with pale sunlight. Corbin didn't sit behind a desk, and he didn't remain standing in the middle of the room. He pulled out an ordinary chair and sat down, then gestured toward the armchair across from him. "Sit." Brielle sat on the edge of the chair. Her back was too straight, not from comfort, but from being ready to rise again at any moment. Her hands rested in her lap, clenched together, hidden beneath the edge of her apron. Corbin looked at her hands. More precisely, he looked at the way she hid them. Not behind her back, not under a table. She folded both hands into one another and pressed them against her thighs, as though she had practiced that movement so long it had become instinct. "Show me your hands," he said. Brielle didn't move. Her eyes remained lowered to her apron, then flicked quickly toward the sitting room door, toward the hallway leading back to the kitchen, where Priscilla could appear at any moment. It was the reflex of checking, the reflex of asking permission, the reflex of someone who had spent 11 months in a house where every action needed approval from someone other than the man sitting in front of her. Corbin recognized that look. He didn't repeat the request. Instead, he said 3 words he knew would change everything. "I saw the cameras." Brielle went still. Not the kind of startle that jerks through the body. The kind of stillness that spread slowly from the inside out, as though the entire defense system she had built over nearly a year had just been unplugged in a single second. Her eyes widened, but she didn't look at him. She stared straight ahead, at a fixed point on the wall behind Corbin's shoulder, like someone who had just been stripped of the one thing that had still protected her, her invisibility. If he had seen the cameras, then he had seen her kneeling on the floor. He had seen the blood. He had seen that she didn't cry out, and she had no way of knowing whether that meant help was coming, or whether she was about to be sent away. Her hands slowly came apart. Deliberately, not out of willingness but out of surrender. She laid them on her thighs, palms up, and Corbin saw. Her right hand, 3 old scars ran across the center of her palm, the skin healed but puckered, the kind of scars formed when cuts weren't stitched and had to close on their own. 2 more recent cuts lay side by side, the skin around them still red and slightly swollen. Her right wrist, a long dark purple bruise stretched along the edge of the ulna, the kind of bruise Corbin recognized at once as coming from impact against a hard edge, the granite kitchen counter, the back of her left hand, a small round burn mark in a place that couldn't have come from careless ironing, because no one irons with the back of a hand. Corbin looked at the map of injuries on those hands and said nothing for several seconds. Then he stood, crossed to the cabinet in the corner of the sitting room, and took out the first aid kit he knew was always kept there. He came back, sat down again, opened the box, and began to work. He poured antiseptic onto a piece of gauze. He took Brielle's right hand gently, turned her palm upward, and began cleaning the 2 newer cuts. The antiseptic touched the open wounds. Brielle didn't pull her hand away. She didn't flinch. She didn't draw in a breath through her teeth. There was not a single reaction to suggest that she felt pain, and that was what made Corbin pause for the briefest instant before continuing. Not because she was brave, because she had become so used to pain that her body no longer bothered to respond to it. He placed adhesive bandages over the 2 cuts, cleaned the bruise on her wrist even though he knew gauze couldn't heal bruising, and spread a thin layer of ointment over the burn on the back of her left hand. The entire process unfolded in silence. When he finished and set her hand back in her lap, Brielle looked down at it. She looked at the clean white bandages wrapped across her palm. She looked at the faint shine of ointment on the back of her hand, and in her eyes there was no relief, no gratitude, no tears. There was only pure confusion. The confusion of a human being who had lived too long in a world where no one touched her except to cause pain. To the point that when someone touched her to heal, she didn't understand why. Corbin didn't rush. He set the first aid kit down on the floor beside his chair, sat across from Brielle again, and waited. He didn't ask right away. He knew that for someone who had lived in silence for 11 months, the first question mattered less than the space given to answer it. "Tell me," he said, "from the beginning." Brielle didn't begin at once. She looked at the bandages on her hand, then down at the floor, then out toward the window, then back down again. Her lips parted twice before any sound came out. When she finally began to speak, her voice wasn't steady. She said 1 sentence, stopped, added half a sentence, went back to correct the sentence before it, then fell silent for several seconds as though asking herself whether she should continue at all. Corbin didn't press her. He didn't nod encouragement. He simply sat there, both hands resting on his thighs, looking at her with the patience of a man who had decided he would listen until she had nothing left to say. Brielle told him about the first month. She said that when she first arrived, everything had seemed normal. The mansion was large, with many rooms, many surfaces to clean, many details to remember. She accepted the amount of work because she had been used to hard labor since childhood, and she wasn't afraid of exhaustion. In those first days, Priscilla seemed pleasant enough, not overly warm, but not cold either. She showed Brielle around the house, pointed out where the supplies were kept, where the laundry was done, the meal hours, the start of the shift, the end of the shift. Everything sounded reasonable. Everything sounded normal. But Priscilla wasn't the one who set the real rules. That was Randall. Brielle said that on the 3rd day, Randall called her into the butler's office downstairs and spoke to her in a calm voice, almost indifferent, as though he were reading from a shopping list. He told her that household staff used the service entrance at the back, not the front door, that when Mr. Hale was home, staff were not to speak unless he addressed them directly, that lunch breaks were to be taken in the service area, not in the main kitchen or any shared family space, that if she had questions about the work, she was to ask him, not Miss Whitmore, and absolutely never Mr. Hale. Brielle paused there and looked at Corbin. She looked at him not to search for a reaction, but to judge whether he had known about those rules. The answer was clear on his face. No, he hadn't known, she went on. She said that at the time, she hadn't found any of it unusual. She had worked in other places before, hotels, restaurants, wealthy households, and many places had separate rules for staff. Not using the front door was normal enough. Not speaking to the owners unless spoken to first was normal enough. Eating lunch in a separate area was normal enough. Each rule, standing by itself, sounded ordinary, and that was exactly how the system had been designed. Brielle spoke the next sentence very slowly, as though she were realizing it for the first time even as she said it aloud. She said that it wasn't until the 3rd month that she understood all those rules weren't house rules at all. They applied only to the maids, and they didn't come from Corbin. They came from Priscilla, through Randall. Every instruction was delivered by Randall. Every warning came through Randall. Every reprimand was issued by Randall. Priscilla never gave a direct order. She never directly said anything that could later be quoted back to her. If Brielle, or any woman before her, had ever spoken up to complain, nothing would have pointed back to Priscilla. Only Randall. And Randall was merely the butler carrying out household management directives. Corbin listened and felt something cold run down his spine. Not fear, but recognition. This wasn't impulsive cruelty. It was architecture. A system built deliberately, layered, buffered, insulated, with distance placed between the one who gave the orders and the ones who suffered the consequences. The kind of system he had seen many times in his own world. He had simply never imagined he would find it inside his own home, operated by the woman who slept beside him every night. Brielle fell silent for quite a while after finishing her account of the hidden system of rules. She looked down at the bandage on her hand as though gathering the strength to step into the next part. Then she drew in a short breath and continued, her voice lower than before, slower than before, like someone walking down a staircase in the dark without knowing how many steps remained below. She said that the first 4 months had been hard, but bearable. The work was heavy, the rules were many, but she knew what she was doing, and she did it well. She wasn't corrected often during that period because she was careful, because she checked everything twice before leaving each room, because she had learned from previous jobs that the best way to survive in someone else's house was to give no one a reason to notice her. But by the 5th month, everything began to change in ways she couldn't have prepared for. The accidents began. Brielle said the word accidents, and then stopped, looked at Corbin, and repeated it again in a different tone. The tone of someone placing quotation marks around a word through the way she spoke it. She said that she started noticing objects placed where no one had any reason to leave them. A crystal glass set too close to the edge of the kitchen counter, exactly where anyone wiping the surface would knock it over. A kitchen knife left on the stone countertop with the blade turned outward, pointed straight toward the hand of whoever stood washing dishes. Water spilled on the marble floor just outside the laundry room, precisely where she stepped every morning while carrying a basin of laundry in her arms and not looking at her feet. The first time, she thought it was coincidence. The second time, she wondered. The third time, she knew. But knowing and proving were two entirely different things. And alongside those accidents, the standards of the job began to shift. Not once and then remain fixed. They shifted constantly, shifted without warning, shifted without any pattern. Today the bath towels were to be folded into rectangles. Tomorrow they had to be folded into squares. This week the flowers in the sitting room were arranged in descending height. Next week, they had to rise in ascending order. The floor cleaning product accepted the previous month was suddenly declared the wrong one this month, though no one had said it had changed. And nothing was ever put in writing. Everything was verbal, through Randall, in brief statements he delivered and then turned away from as though he had merely commented on the weather. Brielle said she began keeping notes. She bought a small pocket notebook and hid it in the inner pocket of her apron. Every time she received a new instruction, she wrote it down. The date, the content, who had said it. She did this not to file a complaint, but to protect her own memory, because she had begun to doubt herself. She had begun to wonder whether she was remembering things wrong, whether the standards were changing, or whether she was the one failing to remember what the original standards had been. The notebook was her way of keeping herself from losing direction. But it was useless, because when she did the work exactly as she had written it down the day before, and was then told it was wrong, she couldn't pull out the notebook and say, "But yesterday you said this." She had no such right. She had no standing to contradict the head butler in the house of a man she wasn't even permitted to speak to. So she put the notebook away, nodded, and did the work again. And each time she did it again, she lost another piece of her trust in herself. Brielle stopped there. Not because the story was over, because she was looking at Corbin with an expression it took him several seconds to understand. She was waiting for him to dismiss it, waiting for him to say she was exaggerating, that perhaps she remembered it wrong, that Priscilla wasn't that kind of woman, that surely there had been some misunderstanding. She was waiting because for the past 11 months, whenever she had recognized that something was wrong in this house, the response she had received had always been denial. Not denial through shouting or anger, denial through normalization, through a tone of voice that made her seem as though she were making too much of it, through looks that suggested she was imagining things, through silence that said her words weren't worth answering. So now, for the first time in her life, as she told someone what had happened, her first instinct was to wait to be denied. Corbin looked at her. He didn't nod. He didn't say, "I understand." He didn't offer any reaction that could be mistaken for indulgence or pity. He said only one word, his voice level, clear, unadorned. "Continue." One word. And it told Brielle more than any comfort ever could. He wasn't dismissing her. He was listening. And she could go on. Brielle continued. This time, she didn't stop to search for words. She spoke like someone who had held too much for too long and could no longer control the force of it once it began to move. She said that by the 8th month, her body had started reacting before her mind could catch up. Every morning, the alarm was set for 5:30 for a 7 o'clock shift, but she could no longer sleep until the alarm. She woke at 4 in the morning, sometimes 3:30, and lay there in the darkness of her small rented room with both hands resting on her chest, feeling her heart beating faster than it should, not because of nightmares, not because of noise, because her body had learned that each new day meant a new day in which she would do something wrong before she even knew what that thing was, and her body prepared for it by refusing to let her sleep any longer. She began sitting up at 4, not to get ready, not to eat breakfast, to breathe. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark room, both feet against the cold floor, and breathed in slowly, then breathed out slowly, again and again. Because if she didn't do that, her hands would shake through the entire first hour after waking. Not from cold, from a nervous system that had been held in a state of alarm for so long that it no longer remembered how to turn itself off. Brielle said that, around this time, she started hiding her injuries, the cuts from broken glass, the bruises from the stone edge of the counter, the small burns she couldn't explain. All of them were hidden beneath long rubber gloves that reached above her elbows, gloves she bought herself. In summer, she wore long sleeves while cleaning windows under the sun, not because anyone forbade her from showing the injuries, because she had come to understand a rule no one ever spoke aloud, yet clearer than any instruction Randall had ever delivered. Being injured was proof of clumsiness, and clumsiness was a reason to be replaced. So she hid. She hid the cuts on her hands. She hid the bruises on her wrists. She even hid the fact that her hands shook every morning. She became an expert at hiding everything except fear, and even that she could only hide by turning it into habit. She stopped there and said one sentence that Corbin would remember longer than any financial report or underground agreement he had ever read in his life. "I'm not afraid of the work," she said, her voice so calm it was almost flat. "I'm afraid of not knowing what I'll do wrong today." The sitting room fell silent. The morning light had turned to noonlight, slanting through the windows and drawing a long band of brightness across the wooden floor between them. Corbin heard that sentence and gave no outward reaction. But inside him, those words cut deeper than any blade in the world beyond this mansion, because he understood exactly what they meant. They meant Brielle wasn't afraid of working 12 hours a day. She was afraid of arbitrariness. She was afraid of a system she couldn't predict, couldn't prepare for, couldn't satisfy because right changed every day, and she was always the last one to know. She was afraid of waking each morning and walking into a house where she had no idea which version of the rules would be enforced that day. He was silent for a while. Then he asked, his voice softer than before, almost a whisper, "Why didn't you tell me?" Brielle looked up, and for the first time in that entire morning, for the first time in the 11 months she had worked in this house, she looked directly into Corbin Hale's eyes. She didn't lower her head. She didn't glance toward the door. She didn't check to see whether Priscilla was standing somewhere nearby. She looked straight at him and said, "How was I supposed to tell you? You were never here. And when you were here, you looked at this house and saw everything as perfect. You never once asked where that perfection came from." Those words weren't loud. They weren't angry. They weren't accusatory. They were simply the truth, spoken by someone who had finally run out of strength to wrap it in silence. And they struck Corbin harder than anything he had ever faced outside the doors of this mansion, because he couldn't deny them. He had looked at this gleaming house for 3 years. He had walked through spotless hallways, sat down at tables laid without a flaw, slept on ironed sheets without a single crease, and not once had he asked who had knelt down to make all of it that way. He looked at Brielle. He didn't apologize, because he knew an apology in that moment would sound more like reflex than commitment. Instead, he said 2 words, "You're right." And Brielle, for the first time that morning, let her shoulders drop a little. That night, after Brielle left the sitting room and returned to the service wing, Corbin didn't go upstairs to the bedroom. He went down to the basement, unlocked the security room with the key that only he possessed, sat in the single chair before the monitors, and turned on the camera system for the second time in 24 hours. But this time, he wasn't looking for Priscilla. He wasn't looking for Randall. He wasn't looking for proof of abuse or for crystal glasses placed where they shouldn't have been. This time, Corbin was looking for himself. He pulled up the footage from the days he had been home during the past month. There weren't many. He counted roughly 7 scattered days, most of them weekends or late evenings before flying somewhere the next morning. He pressed play on the first clip and began to watch. The footage showed him entering through the front door at 9 o'clock on a Friday night. He walked through the main hallway, turned into the kitchen for water, then went upstairs to his study. The hallway was spotless. The kitchen was immaculate. No one was there. He fast-forwarded to the next morning. He came down to the kitchen at 8, made coffee, and sat reading the news on his tablet at the bar counter. During the 15 minutes he sat there, no one entered the kitchen. He left, went upstairs to the sitting room. The kitchen camera recorded what happened next. Exactly 40 seconds after he disappeared from frame, Brielle entered through the rear service door, quick and silent, and began wiping down the bar where he had just been sitting. Corbin kept going, footage from midday that same day. He walked down the second-floor hallway toward the bedroom. The hall camera showed a small figure standing at the far end near the laundry room door. When he appeared at the other end of the hall, that figure stepped back. Not a normal step backward. She retreated into the laundry room doorway, pressed herself against the wall, and disappeared from the hallway before he had even reached the middle. Brielle. She had been standing there, perhaps on her way to collect laundry or bring clean towels to one of the rooms, and the moment she heard his footsteps, she pulled herself into the laundry room as if by reflex, as though his presence was a signal to vanish. Corbin moved on. Another day. He was coming down the main staircase in the morning. The camera showed Brielle wiping the banister on the lower half of the stairs. When she heard his bedroom door open upstairs, she stopped, picked up her bucket and rag, and went down toward the service exit on the first floor. By the time he appeared on the staircase was empty. Only the faint smell of floor cleaner in the air remained as the sole sign that a human being had been there only seconds before. He kept watching. Every clip told the same story. When Corbin was home, Brielle didn't exist. She moved through service corridors. She cleaned the rooms farthest away first, so that when he passed the nearer ones, she would already be somewhere else. She ate lunch in the service area faster than usual on the days he was home. She didn't step into shared spaces until the cameras showed he had gone into the study or upstairs. She had turned herself into a ghost, not because she wanted to, because she had been taught that a good employee was one her employer never had to see. Randall's rule, Priscilla's instruction. But as Corbin watched those clips, he wasn't thinking about Randall or Priscilla. He was thinking about himself, about how many times he had walked down that hallway, come down that staircase, sat in that kitchen, and never once realized there was a person hiding from him. Not hiding because he had done something cruel, hiding because of the power he carried with him every time he entered a room. Power he had believed was a shield for those living under his roof, when in truth it had become one more reason a 27-year-old woman had to press herself against a wall at the sound of his footsteps in the hallway. Corbin switched off the screen. The security room fell into darkness for the second time in 2 nights. He sat there and let the truth sink through every layer of him. His presence in this house wasn't the solution. It was part of the problem. She wasn't afraid of him because he was cruel. She was afraid of him because he had power. And in a house where power meant danger, even a man with the best intentions was still just another threat she had to avoid. The next morning, Corbin woke before dawn even though he had barely slept the night before. He showered, dressed, and went straight into his study. He opened his laptop and pulled up the payroll spreadsheet, all 15 names displayed in full on the screen. Beside the laptop, he placed 4 photographs printed from the camera footage the night before, face down, arranged in order. Then he sat behind the desk. This time he chose the desk, not the sitting room. This time he placed himself in the seat of power on purpose, because the person he was about to speak to wasn't a victim in need of safe space. She was someone who needed to understand that this conversation wasn't a negotiation. He sent Priscilla a single text, "Come to the study." Priscilla arrived within 5 minutes. She was dressed as neatly as always, her hair in place, her face already touched with light makeup, though it was still early morning. She walked into the room with the same confident stride, sat down in the chair across from Corbin's desk, as though this were an ordinary meeting between 2 people who shared a home. She even gave a faint smile as she sat, the polite social smile she used for any situation whose seriousness had not yet been made clear. Corbin didn't return it. He turned the laptop 180 degrees, the screen facing directly toward Priscilla, the 15 names stark against the white background of the spreadsheet. Then he said one word. "Explain." The smile on Priscilla's lips didn't vanish at once. It faded slowly, like a light being dimmed. She looked at the screen, her eyes moving over the lines of names, and Corbin watched her read. He didn't rush her. He had all morning. Priscilla looked up. "It's the household payroll. I manage that area. You know that." "I do know that," Corbin said. "What I'm asking is why there were 15 women in 3 years, and not one of them stayed longer than 3 months. Priscilla drew a small, careful breath and began to answer. The first name, she was too slow. She couldn't keep up with the pace of the work. The second name, she had an attitude problem. She argued when she was given instructions. The third name, she quit without notice. The fourth name, she wasn't reliable. She was often late. The fifth name, she wasn't a fit for the family environment. Every answer was smooth. Every answer came immediately. Every answer sounded reasonable when taken alone. Priscilla's voice remained calm, her eyes fixed on Corbin, neither avoiding him nor hesitating. She had explained these names before, perhaps to herself, perhaps to Randall, perhaps only in her own mind, enough times that each reason had hardened into a finished script. Corbin didn't interrupt. He let her continue. The sixth name, she lacked initiative. The seventh name, she didn't meet hygiene standards. The eighth name, she failed to meet expectations. Corbin raised a hand slightly. "Stop." Priscilla stopped. "You just used the reason failed to meet expectations for 3 women in a row." Priscilla blinked. Only once, quickly, but enough for Corbin to see that she had lost her rhythm. "Each case was different," she said, "but the nature of the problem was the same." "Go on," Corbin said. "The ninth name." Priscilla paused longer before answering. She was too sensitive. She cried when corrected. "The 10th name. Not suitable." "The 11th name." The answer came shorter now, faster, and her eyes had begun dropping to the spreadsheet instead of meeting Corbin's. She wasn't right. "The 12th name." Silence. Priscilla looked at the 12th name on the screen and said nothing. Not because she was thinking, because she had run out of script. 12 names, 12 reasons, and when they were read one after another, without months between them to dilute the truth, they no longer sounded like separate incidents. They sounded like a piece of music made from a single note. Corbin didn't wait for her to answer for the final 2 names. He already knew who those 2 were, Odette and Brielle, the only ones still left, and he had already heard their story. Instead, he reached for the first photograph and turned it over on the desk, a crystal glass resting at the very edge of the kitchen counter, placed where anyone wiping the surface would strike it. He set the photograph down and slid it slightly toward Priscilla, then the second one, a kitchen knife on the counter, the blade turned outward. The third, a pool of water on the marble floor outside the laundry room door. Each photograph was laid down slowly, one after another, with several seconds between them, enough time for Priscilla to see each one clearly before the next appeared. Then the fourth, Brielle kneeling on the kitchen floor, her bare hands bloodied, gathering broken glass, and in the corner of the frame, a figure leaning against the counter, arms crossed, looking down. That figure was Priscilla. Corbin placed the last photograph on the desk and looked at her. She was staring at the fourth image. The polite smile was gone from her face. The smooth calm was gone as well. All that remained was the face of someone who knew that every layer of protection she had built over 3 years had just been peeled away, one by one, in the space of 10 minutes. Corbin spoke, his voice no louder than normal conversation, but every word as clear as a sentence. "This isn't high standards. It's a system." Priscilla stared at the 4 photographs on the desk in a silence that stretched for nearly 10 full seconds. Then she lifted her head, and what happened next wasn't tears, wasn't apology, wasn't collapse. It was anger. She rose from the chair so quickly that it scraped backward and struck the wall behind her with a hard, dry thud. Her eyes were red, but not from crying. They were red because the entire structure of control she had built over 3 years had just been laid out on the desk in 4 photographs and 15 names. And her first response wasn't shame. It was self-defense. "You don't have the right to do this," she said, her voice higher than usual, her hands clenched tight at her sides. "You sit there with 4 photographs and think you understand what's been happening? How many days a month are you even in this house? 7? 8? You disappear for weeks, flying to Philadelphia, Chicago, New York, meeting people whose names I'm not allowed to know, doing things I'm not allowed to ask about, and you leave me behind in an empty house. Not empty because no one is in it. Empty because you aren't. Priscilla took a step to the right, then turned back, one hand lifting and dropping again, her body unable to settle anywhere in the room. I don't have a seat at your meetings. I don't know where you're going tonight or next week. I don't know who's calling you at 2 a.m. I don't control anything in your world. Not one thing. Do you understand what that feels like? To live in the house of the most powerful man in the Northeast and have no power at all? To not know whether you'll come home tomorrow? To not know whether you'll still need me next week? She stopped, breathing fast, her eyes still red, her voice still raised. This house is the only thing I have. The only thing I can control. The only place where, when I speak, people listen. When I give an order, people obey. When I set a standard, people meet it. Do you understand? This is the only place where I feel that I exist. The study fell silent after Priscilla stopped speaking. She stood there, breathing heavily, her shoulders rising and falling, both hands still clenched. She had said everything. Not everything she could argue. Everything she had strength left to carry. Like someone who had held a bomb inside her chest for 3 years and had finally let it detonate. Corbin said nothing while Priscilla spoke. He didn't interrupt, didn't raise an eyebrow, didn't fold his arms, didn't shift his posture. He sat behind the desk and listened. He listened to every word. He listened to her voice climbing higher, then trembling, then rising again. He listened to the anger, and beneath it, he heard what Priscilla herself probably didn't want him to hear. Fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of not existing. Fear that if she didn't have this house and the people inside it obeying her, she would be nothing at all. When Priscilla stopped, and silence returned to the room, Corbin waited a few more seconds. Not to create drama, because he was weighing every word he was about to say, knowing that those next words would shape everything that happened afterward in this house. Then he spoke, his voice no louder than normal, no softer, without emphasis, only clear and steady, like a man stating a fact that required no confirmation. I hear what you're saying. I understand that you feel out of control. But I don't care what you thought while you were doing those things. I care what she felt while they were happening. That's the only thing that's real. Priscilla stood there, her mouth opened, then closed again. Not because she was holding words back, because there were no words. For the first time in 3 years, through 15 maids, through hundreds of smooth explanations she had prepared in advance for every possible situation, Priscilla Whitmore had nothing to say. Because Corbin's words didn't attack her reasons, they attacked her point of view. She had told the story from her own side for 3 years, and believed it was the only story that mattered. And in a single sentence, Corbin had told her that the only story that mattered was the story of the woman kneeling on the kitchen floor. Corbin stood. He didn't walk toward Priscilla. He didn't touch her. He didn't comfort her. He stood behind the desk and delivered the final sentence of that morning. His voice still level, still calm, but carrying the full weight of a decision already made, and no longer subject to change. This house is going to change, with or without you. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't an ultimatum. It was notice. And Priscilla, still standing in the middle of the room with both arms hanging at her sides, understood that the conversation was over. Priscilla left the study without closing the door. Her footsteps echoed through the hallway, then disappeared at the staircase. Corbin remained seated behind the desk, looking at the chair she had just occupied, the cushion still indented with the shape of the body that had only just risen from it. Then he picked up the phone and dialed an internal number in the mansion. Randall, come to the study. Randall arrived within 3 minutes. He entered the room with an upright stride, his hands clasped behind his back, his chin slightly lifted, the posture of a man long accustomed to standing before powerful people without bowing to them. He glanced at the empty chair across from Corbin's desk, understood who had been sitting there before him, but showed no reaction. He sat down, his back straight, both hands resting on his thighs, his eyes fixed directly on Corbin. No fear, no anxiety, only the calm expectation of someone who had prepared an answer for any question that might be asked. You know why I called you in here? Corbin said. It wasn't a question. Randall gave a slight nod. I can imagine. How long have you known what was happening to the maids in this house? Randall didn't hesitate. I carry out household management directives. Miss Whitmore is responsible for all decisions related to staffing and operations. I relay those instructions and oversee their implementation. The answer was smooth, concise, Practiced. Not a word too many. Not a word too few. Exactly like the reasons for resignation on the payroll spreadsheet Corbin had read the morning before. Corbin looked at Randall and understood that he wasn't like Priscilla. Priscilla had become angry because she had been exposed. Randall wasn't angry, wasn't worried, wasn't defensive. He was simply doing what he had always done, performing his role, delivering the correct script, maintaining the system. And that was precisely why Corbin had no intention of extending this conversation. "I've seen the footage," Corbin said. "The night Brielle was picking glass off the kitchen floor." "You were there." Randall gave no reaction. "You had a towel in your hand. You were standing 6 feet away from her. She was kneeling on the floor, picking up broken glass with her bare hands, blood running from her palm, and you stood there holding a towel you didn't hand to her." Silence. What directive required that? Randall didn't answer. Not because he was searching for words, because there was no script for this question. Household management directives didn't include a line that said stand there and watch someone bleed without doing anything. That had been a choice. His choice. And he knew it. Corbin held Randall's gaze for a few more seconds, then spoke, his voice neither rising nor falling, only as clear as the edge of a sharpened blade. "In my world, there are two kinds of dangerous people, the kind who do harm, and the kind who see harm being done and choose to hold the towel instead of handing it over. The second kind is worse, because they have a choice, and they choose to stand still." Randall looked at Corbin, and in that moment, for the first time in the entire conversation, something changed in his eyes. Not remorse, not fear, recognition. The recognition that the script of, "I was only following orders," wouldn't work with the man sitting across from him. Because the man sitting across from him was Corbin Hale, and Corbin Hale knew better than anyone that following orders had never been a valid excuse for letting someone else bleed. "You're leaving the mansion today," Corbin said. "You'll be paid in full through the end of the month. There's nothing more to discuss." Randall stood. He didn't argue, didn't ask for a second chance, didn't offer further explanation. He gave one nod, turned, and walked out of the room. His footsteps in the hallway were steady, no faster and no slower than usual, the footsteps of a man who had spent his whole life carrying out orders and was now carrying out his last one. Corbin sat alone in the study. In front of him was the desk, with the laptop still open, the 4 photographs still face up, and 2 empty chairs. Priscilla's chair, Randall's chair, both of them still warm. He looked at those 2 chairs in silence, then picked up the phone once more. "Odette, could you come up to the study?" Odette arrived more slowly than Priscilla and Randall, not because she was farther away, because she walked more slowly, with the careful steps of a 60-year-old woman whose knees had grown tired, though her back was still straight. When she entered the room, she stopped at the threshold and looked around. This was a room she had entered hundreds of times, to dust the desk, vacuum the carpet, clean the window glass, but never to sit in it. Corbin pointed to the chair across from him. Odette sat down, her back against the chair, both hands resting on the armrests. For the first time in many years, she was sitting in this room as someone invited to be there. "You sent the photograph," Corbin said. "Yes. You apologized for not speaking sooner when you called last night." Odette gave a slight nod. Corbin looked at her. "You don't need to apologize. You were the only person in this house who dared to do the right thing, even if it came late. I'm the one who owes the apology, for not seeing, for not asking, for letting 3 years pass without knowing what was happening beneath my own roof." Odette looked at Corbin and said nothing for several seconds. Then she nodded, slowly, only once, the nod of someone accepting an apology not because it was enough, but because it was real. "I need a household manager," Corbin said. "Someone who understands this house better than anyone, someone who's been here the longest, someone I trust." Odette looked at him, then glanced around the room once more, at the desk she had dusted hundreds of times, at the chair she was sitting in for the first time, at the window frame whose glass she had cleaned every Tuesday. Then she said, "I accept." After Odette left the study, Corbin remained there for a few more minutes, then opened his laptop again. He logged into the banking system, opened Brielle's payroll record, and began recalculating everything from the beginning. He checked every month, every entry, comparing her actual working hours on the camera footage against the timesheets Randall had recorded. There were days when Brielle had worked 2 or 3 extra hours without being paid for them. There were days when she had been marked as leaving early, while the cameras showed her still dusting the sitting room at 7 in the evening. Corbin recalculated everything carefully, then did it all a second time to make sure he hadn't missed a single amount. When he finished, the unpaid total wasn't small. He transferred the full sum into Brielle's account and added one brief note in the payment description. Back wages, fully recalculated. Then he sent for Brielle. She came to the study with the same familiar walk, short steps, lowered shoulders, eyes fixed on the floor. But this time, when she entered, she noticed the room was different from the way it had always been when she came in to clean. The desk held no scattered papers. The chair across from him had already been pulled out. And Corbin was looking at her not with the expression of a man about to give an order, but with the expression of a man about to say something difficult. "Sit," he said. Brielle sat down. On the edge of the chair, as always. "I want you to rest," Corbin said. 1 week. Paid. The back wages were transferred to your account this morning. Brielle looked at him. Her eyes blinked twice, quickly. Then she asked, her voice small, almost a whisper, "Am I being dismissed?" The question didn't surprise Corbin. He had known she would ask it, because for the past 11 months, every change in this house had meant something worse for her. Every time something shifted, she lost something else. So when the owner of the house said rest, what she heard was leave. Corbin looked at her and spoke slowly, each word clear. "You're not being dismissed. You're being allowed to leave a place that needs to be repaired before it can welcome you back the right way." Brielle heard that and fell silent. Her eyes began to fill, but she didn't cry. She held the tears back by tightening her jaw slightly and lowering her gaze to her hands, still wrapped in bandages from the day before. She nodded once, then she rose slowly, like someone trying to understand what had just happened. Corbin called a car for her. He walked with her into the hallway, past the sitting room, past the kitchen. When they came near the rear service door, the one she had used for 11 straight months, Corbin stopped. "Use the front door," he said. Brielle looked at him. Then she looked toward the front entrance at the far end of the main hall. The great wooden door she had never stepped through since the first day Randall had told her that staff did not use it. She walked toward the front door. Her footsteps along the main hallway sounded louder than they ever had in the service corridor, because the wood floor here was heavier, and she had never walked slowly enough in this part of the house to hear the echo of her own steps. She put her hand on the handle, turned it, and pulled the heavy wooden door open. Afternoon sunlight poured in, touching her face, her eyes, the white bandages around her hand. Brielle paused on the threshold. 1 second. Only 1 second. But in that second, she stood in the front doorway of the house, where she had worked for 11 months. Sunlight on her face, a soft breeze moving through her hair, like someone who had forgotten what it felt like to leave by the front door and needed one moment to remember. Then she stepped outside, and the door closed behind her. During Brielle's week away, Corbin didn't rest. On the very first day, he sat with Odette in the study for 4 straight hours. Together they went through every operational detail of the mansion, from work schedules to task lists, from shift distribution to lunch break procedures. Everything before had existed by word of mouth, through Randall's spoken directives, through shifting standards no one ever wrote down. Corbin changed all of it. He and Odette drafted a detailed work schedule, printed on paper, with start times, end times, fixed lunch breaks, and a clear list of tasks assigned to each day of the week. The new rule was simple. Every instruction had to be in writing. No one would be given verbal orders and then have those orders denied later. If a standard changed, the date of the change had to be recorded, along with the old requirement and the new one. Odette read the first draft and corrected 3 parts she knew would create confusion for the people carrying it out. Corbin didn't argue. He changed them exactly as she advised. Because she understood this house better than he did. She understood the work inside this house better than he did. And the past 3 years had already proven that whenever he thought he understood without truly looking, the consequences landed on someone else's shoulders. By the middle of the week, once the mansion had begun operating under the new system with Odette overseeing it, Corbin did something he told no one about. He opened the payroll file again on his laptop, found the 9th name, Ruth Calloway, and searched through her old insurance information. It took about an hour to identify her current address. Ruth was working at a small laundry shop in Dorchester, south of Boston. Corbin drove there alone. He brought no one with him. He gave no warning. He parked about 20 yards from the shop and sat in the car, looking through the front window. Inside, a woman around 50 years old, silver-haired too early, small in frame, stood at a folding table. Her hands moved steadily, slowly, folding one shirt after another, one pair of pants after another, setting each item into neat piles. No rush, no glance over her shoulder, no checking to see who might be watching. There was no defensive posture left in her body. Only the quiet peace of someone doing simple work in a place where no one required her to be afraid. Corbin looked at that peace through the car window and understood that it hadn't come naturally. It had been rebuilt. Out of the wreckage his house had left behind. He stepped out of the car, crossed the sidewalk, pushed open the glass door of the laundry, and went inside. The bell over the door gave a small chime. Ruth looked up, and her body reacted before her mind could recognize who was standing there. Her shoulders tightened. The hand that had been folding a shirt stopped halfway through the motion. One foot shifted half a step back, slight, almost unconscious. A reflex. Not the reflex of someone recognizing a familiar face. The reflex of a body that had once lived in fear and still hadn't entirely forgotten how. Corbin stopped 6 feet away from her. The same distance Randall had stood from Brielle in the kitchen that night. But this time, the man standing 6 feet away wasn't holding a towel he refused to give. The man standing 6 feet away said, "I didn't come here to ask for anything. I came to apologize." Ruth looked at him, silent. Her shoulders slowly lowered, but her hand still held the half-folded shirt. "Is she still there?" she asked softly. Corbin understood that she meant Priscilla. "That is changing," he said. Ruth looked down at the shirt in her hands, then back up at him. "When I left your house, I thought something was wrong with me. I thought I was weak, too sensitive, not good enough. It took me almost a year to stop checking the way I folded towels. Here, in this laundry shop, where no one cares how I fold them, I still fold one, then unfold it and do it again, because in my head I still hear someone's voice telling me I folded it wrong." Corbin listened and said nothing. "I believe you," Ruth said. "I believe you came here to apologize. But it's going to take a long time before I believe myself. Before I believe that there was never anything wrong with me. That there had never been anything wrong with me at all." She looked at him a moment longer, then turned back to finish folding the shirt in her hands and placed it on the neat stack in front of her. Corbin remained there for a few seconds more. There was nothing else to say. The apology had been spoken. It wasn't enough to erase a full year of folding towels, then unfolding them and folding them again in fear. But it had been spoken. He gave Ruth a slight nod, turned, and walked back out of the shop. The bell over the door chimed once more as it closed behind him. Corbin got back into the car, shut the door, and didn't start the engine. He sat there, both hands resting on the steering wheel, staring straight through the windshield at the quiet afternoon street. And for the first time in a very long while, he felt the true weight of something all his money, all his power, and all his underground empire could never buy back. The time other people had lost. On the 5th day of her week away, Corbin's phone vibrated at 7 in the evening. Brielle's number. He answered before the second ring had time to finish. The line stayed silent for a few seconds. Then Brielle's voice came through, steadier than the last time he had heard her speak in the sitting room, yet still carrying the careful restraint of someone weighing every word before letting it fall. "I've been thinking," she said. "I talked to my mother." Corbin waited. "She asked me if I wanted to go back. I told her I didn't know. She asked me what I was afraid of. I told her I was afraid everything would be the way it was before." Silence. She said that if I was afraid and still wanted to try, then maybe I had already made my decision. I just hadn't said it out loud yet. Brielle drew in a small breath. "I'm coming back." Corbin didn't answer at once, not because he hesitated, but because he wanted to let her finish. "But if at any point it feels the way it used to feel, I'm leaving." No explanation, no negotiation, no permission from anyone. "I leave." Her voice didn't shake. It wasn't raised. It carried no emphasis. It was simply clear, like someone who had thought about that sentence for 5 full days and, by the time she spoke it, no longer needed to rehearse it. Corbin said, "That's your right. It always was your right." Silence again on both ends of the line. Then Brielle asked, "Is Monday all right?" "Yes." "What time?" 7 o'clock, like usual." "All right." She hung up. Corbin set the phone down on the table and sat still for a moment. Then he stood, went into the study, sat down, and began to write. Not an email, not a message. He took the task sheet he and Odette had prepared during the week, the version already printed, already reviewed, already complete. He read through it one final time, then turned to the bottom of the page and wrote one line by hand in black ink. His handwriting wasn't elegant, slightly slanted, heavy in stroke, but clear. If you have a question, ask. There are no wrong questions. That night he placed the sheet on the kitchen counter, exactly where the first person to enter the kitchen the next morning would see it. Monday. 7 a.m. The sound of the front doorbell echoed through the hallway. Not the bell at the rear service entrance. The front doorbell. Odette opened the door. Brielle stood on the threshold with a backpack over her shoulder, just as she had on every workday for the previous 11 months, except for one thing. She was standing at the front door. She stepped inside, nodded to Odette, walked through the main hallway she had never once dared to use during working hours, and turned into the kitchen. On the counter, the sheet lay exactly where Corbin had left it. Brielle set her backpack down, picked up the paper, and read it. The task list. The start time. The lunch break, marked clearly, not tucked away as a note in the corner, but given its own line in bold. The end time. Each task listed specifically, with no vagueness, no room for anyone to reinterpret it at will and deny it later. She read to the bottom of the page, the handwritten line. If you have a question, ask. There are no wrong questions. Brielle read that line twice. Then she folded the sheet carefully, slipped it into the pocket of her apron, and began the first task of the morning. There was no ceremony, no speech, no forced smile from someone stepping into a place she wasn't sure was safe. There was only work, and a sheet of paper in her pocket that she knew she could pull out at any moment to confirm that what she was doing was right. Around 8 o'clock, while Brielle was wiping down the kitchen counter, a figure appeared in the doorway. Priscilla. She stood on the threshold without stepping inside, one hand resting lightly against the frame, like someone unsure whether she was supposed to be there at all. "Good morning," Priscilla said. Her voice was soft, a little different from the voice Brielle had grown used to over the past 11 months. Not dramatically different, but enough to be noticed. Brielle looked up at Priscilla. 1 second. Then she said, "Good morning." Nothing more, nothing less. 2 words. But they sounded different from every other time those same 2 words had been spoken in that kitchen in the months before. In the days after Brielle returned, Priscilla changed in a way Corbin hadn't expected. She didn't resist, didn't turn cold, didn't try to sabotage things in secret. She disappeared, not by leaving the mansion, by disappearing inside her own house. In the mornings, when Brielle began her shift in the kitchen, Priscilla no longer appeared there. She drank her coffee in the bedroom instead of at the kitchen bar as she had before. At noon, when Brielle took her lunch break at the kitchen table under the new schedule, Priscilla stayed in the reading room on the 2nd floor. In the afternoons, when Brielle cleaned the sitting room, Priscilla sat alone on the back terrace. She avoided every space Brielle was using, not by any planned schedule, but by instinct, by the reflex of someone who had recognized herself as a source of danger and was trying to make up for it by erasing her presence entirely. When Brielle finished her work at the end of the day and reported to Odette, sometimes she passed Priscilla in the hallway. Priscilla would stop, step aside, and say thank you, in a soft, quick, slightly awkward voice, the voice of someone practicing a word she had never used before with a maid. Brielle would nod and keep walking. There was no tension, but there was nothing natural either. Everything carried an air of excessive caution, like 2 people walking on the same wire while both feared that one wrong movement would send everything crashing down. Corbin watched this through the first week and said nothing. He watched Priscilla retreat from each room whenever Brielle entered it. He watched her eat dinner in silence, her eyes on her plate, not on him. He watched her go upstairs earlier than usual every evening, as though the house she had once considered her kingdom had become a place where she no longer knew how much space she was allowed to occupy. By Thursday night, after dinner, Corbin was sitting in the sitting room while Priscilla was rising to go upstairs as she had every evening. He spoke in an ordinary voice, without heaviness, without sarcasm. "You don't need to disappear from your own house." Priscilla stopped in mid-step. She didn't turn around right away. She stood there with her back slightly bent, one hand resting on the back of the chair, like someone caught doing something she wasn't sure she was allowed to do. Then she turned, looked at Corbin, and said in a low, slow voice, each word carrying the weight of an honesty she still wasn't used to using, "I don't know how to be present without controlling. That sentence hung in the air of the sitting room for several seconds. And what Corbin heard in it wasn't an excuse. It was an admission. Priscilla wasn't saying, "I don't want to change," or "I don't think I was wrong." She was saying, "I don't know how." And "I don't know how" is something entirely different from "I don't want to." It means she saw the problem, but didn't have the tools to fix it. It means that 3 years of controlling everyone in that house wasn't a habit she could abandon simply by deciding to abandon it. It had worked its way into the structure of how she existed, and taking it apart would require more than good intentions. Corbin looked at her and said, "That's exactly what you need to tell a therapist, not me." Priscilla didn't react immediately. She stood there another few seconds, then gave a small nod, turned, and went upstairs. Her footsteps on the wooden stairs were lighter than they had been in the days before, as though she had just set down something heavy she had been carrying all week. The following week, Priscilla saw a therapist. Corbin already had the name of one, recommended by an associate months earlier, a name he had saved without ever thinking he would use it. He sent the information to Priscilla without any added comment. She made the appointment the same day she received it. The first session lasted an hour. When Priscilla returned, she said nothing. She walked straight through the hallway, up the stairs, into the bedroom, and closed the door. Corbin was sitting in the sitting room reading when he heard the bedroom door shut upstairs. He didn't go up to ask. He didn't knock. He knew that a first therapy session wasn't for healing, it was for opening the lid. And when the lid had just been opened, a person needed a quiet place to sit with whatever was inside before they could speak of it to anyone else. After the second therapy session, Priscilla came home and still said nothing. She went straight upstairs to the bedroom, just as she had the first time. Corbin didn't ask. The third session was different. Priscilla returned close to 4 in the afternoon. She didn't go upstairs. She walked into the sitting room, where Corbin was reading in the armchair by the window. She sat down in the chair beside him and said nothing for nearly half a minute. Corbin lowered the book into his lap, but didn't set it aside. He waited. Priscilla looked at her hands resting together in her lap, turning her engagement ring with her thumb, back and forth, as though weighing every word before saying it. Then she began. She asked me a question I couldn't answer. Corbin lowered the book the rest of the way and placed it on the table beside the chair. She asked, "If I woke up tomorrow and no one in this house listened to me, no maid, no house manager, no one at all, what would I do first?" Priscilla stopped, not to create drama, because she was reliving that moment, sitting in the therapy room with that question hanging in the air and finding nothing in her mind to answer it with. "I sat there for 3 minutes," she said, her voice low and slow, each word sounding as though it were being pulled out of some deep place inside her. 3 minutes staring at the wall, and I couldn't think of anything, not because I didn't want to answer. I had no answer. I don't know what I would do if there were no one to listen to me. I don't know who I am if there's no one to control. The sitting room fell silent. The late afternoon light had softened, a pale orange glow spilling through the windows and falling across the rug between them. Corbin didn't answer. Not because he didn't know what to say, because he understood that what Priscilla had just said wasn't for him to answer. She needed to hear herself say it aloud, in front of another person, the thing she had already said in therapy but needed to say once more in order to believe it was real. They sat there in silence for a long while, but this silence was different from the silence at dinner the week before, when Priscilla stared at her plate and never looked at him, different from the silence of the years before that, when both of them avoided any conversation that might lead somewhere uncomfortable. This was the silence of two people sitting beside each other and looking at something difficult they both understood would take a very long time. Priscilla stood after about 10 minutes and went upstairs without saying anything else. Corbin remained where he was, picked up his book again, but didn't continue reading. In the third week after Brielle's return, on a Tuesday morning, Priscilla slipped for the first time. Brielle was standing in front of the open refrigerator, arranging the shelves inside according to the morning task list. Priscilla passed through the kitchen doorway on her way from the bedroom to the reading room. She stopped at the kitchen entrance, looked into the refrigerator, and before she could think, before the newer part of her could stop the older part, she tilted her head slightly and said, "Tall items should go on the top shelf. Easier to see that way." Her voice was light, not sharp, not cold, but the tone was something Brielle recognized at once. The tone of instruction. The tone that didn't require a response because it assumed the only response would be obedience. The tone Brielle had heard hundreds of times over 11 months, from Randall, from the atmosphere Priscilla had created, from the system the whole house had once operated under. Brielle said nothing. She was silent. 1 second. Only 1 second. But in that 1 second of silence, Priscilla heard herself. She heard the tone. She heard the way that sentence had come out of her mouth, carrying the weight of 3 years of orders that required no explanation. And she stopped. "I'm sorry," Priscilla said, quickly, not as a reflex of politeness, as the reflex of someone who has just touched a hot stove and jerked back. "I didn't need to say it like that. You can keep the current arrangement." Brielle looked at Priscilla. There was no fear in her eyes, no defensiveness, only the calm of someone who knew she had the right to speak and chose to use it. "If you want it changed, just say so. Once is enough." Priscilla gave a small nod. Tall items on the top shelf. Brielle turned back to the refrigerator and rearranged it. Priscilla remained there for another second at the kitchen doorway, then turned and continued on her way. Nothing more. No long conversation, no explanation, no drama. Only a request, said the right way, heard the right way, and carried out the right way. Out in the hallway, Odette stood beside the laundry room door with a stack of clean towels in her arms. She had heard all of it. Not because she had been trying to listen, because for 3 years she had grown used to listening to every sound from that kitchen in order to know what kind of day it would be. She heard Priscilla speak in the old tone. She heard the 1 second of silence. She heard the apology, and she heard Brielle answer in an ordinary voice. Without fear, without bitterness, simply ordinary. Odette stood there with the towels in her arms, and her shoulders lowered. Slightly, slowly, like someone who had been holding them tight for 3 years and, for the first time, allowed herself to let go. 3 months passed. Nothing significant happened. And that was exactly the most significant thing of all. The mansion still ran. The rooms were still clean. Everything was still in its place. Meals still arrived on time. Flowers were still arranged. Floors still polished. Windows still clear. But the quality of the silence inside the house had changed completely. It was no longer the silence of people holding their breath. No longer the silence of someone counting every footstep to avoid making the wrong sound. It was ordinary silence now. The silence of a house where people worked, rested, and left at the end of the day without having to calculate every movement. Brielle no longer woke up at 4 a.m. She slept until her alarm rang at 5:30, woke, got ready, and arrived at the mansion at 7, through the front door. Every morning. Her hands didn't shake when she reached for the handle. She no longer hid injuries beneath long gloves, because there were no injuries left to hide. She no longer carried the small notebook in the pocket of her apron, because every instruction was in writing now, posted on the board in the kitchen area. Clear, stable, changed only when a written revision was placed beside it. At midday, Brielle ate at the kitchen table. Not in the service wing, not in some hidden corner behind the laundry room. At the kitchen table, where natural light from the large windows fell across the surface, where she could look out at the garden while she ate. Odette often sat with her. The two of them didn't talk much. Sometimes Odette commented on the weather, that the sky was better today than it had been yesterday, or asked whether Brielle wanted her to buy more of a certain tea because she was going to the market that weekend. Short conversations. Ordinary conversations. Conversations without purpose. The kind people who work together in a safe place exchange simply because they feel like speaking. And there was one detail Corbin noticed before anyone else did. One morning, around the 10th week after Brielle returned, Corbin went down to the kitchen at 8 to make coffee. He walked through the main hallway, turned into the kitchen, and found Brielle standing at the counter, putting dishes back into the cabinet after washing up from breakfast. When he entered, she looked up at him, gave a small nod, then turned back and kept stacking the dishes. She didn't disappear. She didn't retreat into the laundry room doorway. She didn't move into the service corridor. She didn't try to leave the room before he could realize she was there. For the first time, Brielle stayed exactly where she was when Corbin appeared. He made his coffee, stood a few steps away from her at the counter, took a sip, then left the kitchen. No one said anything. Nothing needed to be said. But that moment, the moment when a 27-year-old woman remained standing in the kitchen while the owner of the house walked in instead of shrinking into the shadows, was the clearest proof yet that something in this house had changed. On an ordinary afternoon, Brielle was cleaning the sitting room windows. The late sunlight came through the glass in long stripes across the wooden floor. She stood on a small step stool. a damp cloth in her right hand, her left hand steadying the window frame, wiping in long strokes from top to bottom. Priscilla passed by in the hallway. She stopped at the doorway of the sitting room, watched Brielle cleaning, said nothing. She stood there for about 2 seconds, then turned and went into the kitchen. A minute later, Priscilla came back. In her hand was a cup of hot tea. She walked over to the windowsill where Brielle was working and set the cup down on the ledge, gently, without letting it touch any of Brielle's cleaning things. Then she turned and walked on. She didn't say a word. No praise. No condition. No, you're doing well, or you should take a break, or any other sentence that could be mistaken for an order disguised as concern. Just a cup of tea, set down, then gone. Brielle stopped wiping and looked at the tea. Steam rose lightly in the afternoon sun, curling upward and dissolving into the light. She looked at that cup longer than she normally would have, not because it was extraordinary, because she needed a moment to understand that it came with nothing attached. No, drink this and then remember to dust the second floor shelves. No, take a quick break and then get back to work. Nothing followed it. It was only tea, poured by the woman who, 3 months earlier, had stood watching her pick up broken glass with her bare hands. Brielle picked up the cup, took a sip, then set it back on the windowsill and resumed cleaning. At the far end of the hallway, Corbin stood with one shoulder against the wall. He had seen Priscilla walk into the kitchen. He had seen her return with the tea. He had seen her set it down on the windowsill and continue walking without a word. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. It was only a cup of tea. But in a house where even the smallest action had once been turned into a tool of control, a cup of tea without conditions was the simplest thing that house could offer. And for a very long time, it had been the hardest thing that house had ever learned to give. Corbin Hale built an empire through strength. He had walked through rooms other people didn't dare even look into. He had made decisions whose consequences were measured in human lives. But the hardest thing he had ever done wasn't facing enemies outside the doors of his mansion. It was sitting down in his own sitting room, looking at the scarred hands of a 27-year-old woman, and listening as she spoke about those cuts in a voice so calm it was terrifying, the voice of someone who had forgotten she had the right to say she was hurting. Nothing in this story happened in a single day. It began with a photograph sent at midnight by the trembling hand of a 60-year-old woman who had stayed silent for far too long and finally decided that enough was enough. It was built further, one morning at a time, through apologies that came late but still came, through a cup of tea set on a windowsill without a single demand attached to it, through a choice repeated every day by people who had finally come to understand that real power doesn't lie in the ability to control others, but in the ability to truly see the person standing right in front of you. And that is the lesson in this story for all of us as well. Sometimes the deepest wounds don't come from violence, but from indifference. Sometimes the person who needs saving isn't far away at all, but living under the very same roof. And sometimes the greatest change doesn't begin with some grand act, but with the simple choice to stop and truly see the human being standing before you. If this story touched your heart, please press the like button to support us in continuing to bring meaningful stories to you every day. Please share this video with the people you love, because someone out there may need to hear this more than you know. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please subscribe now and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next stories to come. We'd truly love to know how this story made you feel. Did it make you think of someone, remember something, or connect you to a moment in your own life? Please leave a comment below and share it with us, because every line written from the depths of your heart is the greatest encouragement we could receive to keep going on this journey. Wishing everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in each new day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you in the next video.